welcome to everybody who's watching this in real time, and to viewers of the recording on the Project for Peaceful Competition site. This is one of a series of conferences we're holding to discuss issues related to the current state of geopolitics, in particular great power rivalry, and the issues that arise from geopolitics for humanity as a whole from that rivalry to deal with it. Enormously grateful to the Finnish Institute of International Affairs for hosting this particular conference. It's perhaps very appropriate that this should be hosted just at this moment in Finland, given the long history of Finland's own efforts to maintain its independence and freedom at a time when we see for the first time in our adult lives, for I suspect almost everyone watching this, the invasion of one European country by another. And it's also particularly fitting that we should be having a conference about these topics at such a moment, because clearly, as well as the horrors for those living in Ukraine at the moment, the current situation illustrates very clearly the disasters for humanity that arise when geopolitics and diplomacy fail to find resolutions that preserve the peace and the integrity of nations. And I'm therefore very grateful to the speakers who are taking part in this particular session, and as I say, to the FIIA for hosting it. And without further ado, I hand over to Mikkel Vigel, who's been organizing all this at the FIIA.
Thanks a lot, Oliver, and warmly welcome on my behalf as well, and on the behalf of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs to this two-day online conference on Sino-Western relations in the new geoeconomic world order. And it's really been a pleasure for myself and Marie-Louise Hinsberg to prepare this conference together with Oliver Letwin and Molly Kinneary of the Project of Peaceful Change at King's College London. And at FIIA we're indeed very happy and pleased to be part of this ambitious and broad and highly pertinent initiative to think hard and ahead of the present and future of Sino-Western relations. To me, at least, it seems clear that the West finds itself in a new Cold War with Russia and Ukraine, of course, in a very hot war as a result of Russia's very brutal aggression. And all our sympathies are, of course, right now with the Ukrainians. From the perspective of the international system, the big question now really is, it seems to me at least, is whether China will partner with Russia or not, or to what extent it will do so. If it does, the new Cold War risks going global, largely pitting the democratic world against authoritarianism. We're necessarily not there yet. So the choice China now makes will have major reverberating implications for the international system for decades to come. Then again, if China chooses or refrains from sheltering Russia, it may actually open up new ways for better Sino-Western relations, whereby any new Cold War would then also be perhaps more limited and geopolitics probably more contained. Russia has already for some time been trying to drag us back to the traditional geopolitical game board, because it's where Russia feels comparatively stronger. It's only through military means that Russia thinks it can rebuild its empire that Kremlin clearly craves for. On the geoeconomic game board, Russia can't really compete and keeps losing ground. But whether China also wants for traditional military geopolitics to return is less clear, I think. After all, China is the one that perhaps most successfully has been playing the geoeconomic game through economic means, trade, loans, investments, the Belt and Road Initiative. China has very effectively been binding other countries to itself, making them dependent on China. And through that, China has also got a lot of political leverage. China has no official security allies, but it increasingly controls a sort of geoeconomic hub and spoke system and a sort of economic sphere of interest, perhaps, which doesn't catalyze the sort of counter reactions, counterbalancing that more overtly traditional geopolitical strategies and means would certainly have done. So instead, China has been offering economic carrots, I think, also to us in the West, with many jumping sort of into the bandwagon and now finding themselves increasingly dependent on China. So I guess for China, it now also must be tempting to do the same geoeconomic trick with Russia, providing it economic shelter in exchange for control and perhaps an asymmetric partnership. But the question really is whether China would then risk overplaying its hand, geoeconomically overstretching and putting in jeopardy some of its other economic relationships with the rest, including some with the West and states for whom Russia has become a pariah state and who calls for the economic containment now of Russia. So I think this conference really deals with the most profound issues at the most critical time possible, almost. The return of geopolitics, the rise of geoeconomics, which trend will prove stronger and come to define Sino-Western relations, and through that much of the international system. At FIIA, when we started our geoeconomics initiative some 10 years ago, we did so very much on the assumption that for all the talk about liberal peace and China's integration into the liberal international order, strategic competition had gone nowhere. It was just changing form. Competition and conflict would predominantly play out in the economic domain through economic means, rather than by traditional militarily oriented geopolitics. And as long as the world was as interdependent and interconnected as ours, the threshold to use military means would remain high, which wouldn't necessarily mean a very cooperative international order, but a more geoeconomic world order in which states would focus more on relative economic gains and become more concerned with risks with interdependence in terms of undermining perhaps state control and self-sufficiency and resilience. So we would see more balancing against dependence, more pursuit of economic autonomy, increasing protectionism, if you will. However, we also recognize the fundamental dilemma in that geoeconomic order, and that is when everybody starts to balance against dependence and pursue more economic autonomy. The interdependent and interconnected character of the international system, globalization itself, will start to unravel, and with that, the threshold to use military means will again start to come down. And with that sort of balancing against dependence and decoupling, we will become less dependent on each other, and the world less interdependent and interconnected, and geoeconomics in turn less effective as a means of strategic competition. So then also military means may again start entering the stage, and traditional geopolitics would make a return. And Russia has, of course, now mistakenly thought it was largely self-sufficient, and so few hindrances to use military aggression against Ukraine. And as a consequence, we've seen unprecedented Western sanctions implemented against Russia. With regard to the Sino-Western relations, we've seen increasing decoupling, economic decoupling in recent years. And though we're far from the sort of deterioration of relations that we've seen with Russia, there is the risk that we're sleepwalking into a situation of economic warfare, economic containment. And we will need, of course, be very vigilant on this question and manage our relations much sooner and better. And this conference, I think, really revolves around this, the need to think hard and a bit of ahead how to manage relations with China, given this slightly gloomy background. And I'm very much looking forward to all 4 panels which deal with this issue from a variety of angles and perspectives. And with that, I'll give the floor to FIIA Director Mika Aaltola, who will be chairing the opening panel of this online conference. And very welcome once more to this conference. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Wickel. Great honor and pleasure to be here. As Wickel already pointed out, we have been working on the topic since 2012, I think. We discussed back then flow security and global flows and kind of the relevance of that in today's world, where, as Wickel pointed out, geoeconomic, the trend is facing also the simultaneous trend of increasing geopolitical measures, and then you have overlapping practices that needs to be charted out. Back then, we were thinking about kind of a broader issues, kind of grand strategic games that are increasingly happening through geoeconomic means, geoeconomic competition, and broadly use economic, technological, and infrastructural tools to achieve geostrategic goals. And now, when we are focusing on the issue, the geopolitical issue in front of us, the Russian war of aggression, breaking the norms, rules, and institutions, the pan-European ones, of course, we are kind of facing the puzzle of how does this work out, the big abstract level understanding of the importance of geoeconomics, and at the same time kind of being tracked downwards to the geopolitical game board, and how they interact, I think, is a key issue here when we are discussing China-Western relations. As you know, there's currently being there's expansion of the sanctions regime that also takes into account secondary sanctions, thereby China would be included. So there's a deterrence that is being created, so economic deterrence that is being created against China's desire or potential desires to balance with Russia against the West. So this is a tricky game, and we are living this time in the history for the first time. So we can draw historical lessons in building scenarios. That is something that we have to do, but there's also room for surprises and contingencies and emergence of new sets of ideas and practices. It is clear that what we are now facing is going to be complicated, complex, and long-lasting, and thereby we need to also think about what we are seeing, the empirical evidence, and think again our abstract models, how this does this interact with them, how should we modify those. So that's one key topic that we're going to be discussing in the first panel, and I have to say that I'm very excited, almost stimulated already before the panel discussion and conversation. We have an excellent set of panelists, top-notch, first caliber people, experts on the fields that interconnect with geoeconomics and power politics. So what does interdependency mean in today's world? How is that being leveraged for power political ends? There's discussions on the closure of Bosporus. Actually, it has already happened when it comes to military vessels of Russia. US is discussing the closure of Panama and Suez. Big things are happening also outside of the painful to watch and follow war of destruction in Ukraine. But let me introduce the panelists shortly. They are very well known, but they also need introductions. I'm very pleased to have Alexander Stubb with us here, professor, currently a professor and director of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute. His list of positions is very expansive and long. Prime Minister, Finance Minister, Foreign Minister of Finland, Trade and European Minister, various positions in the European Commission and in the key European institutions and processes. All of us in Finland and in Europe and more widely also know Alex very well. So you are your own CV. It's tattooed on your appearance, so I won't go deeper into that. Then we have Thea Roberts. Very pleased to have you with us. She's a professor at the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University. She's very interdisciplinary research and legal scholar, focusing on new avant-garde ways of thinking about complexity and evolving global fields, including international law, trade, investment, effect of geopolitical change on global governance. And also she has been able to help us navigating the complexities of the current system. We need some clarity, so Thea, you are here to provide us with clarity on this complicated interactions between geopolitics and geoeconomy. And then we have Mikael Wikell, who is a leading China and Taiwan scholar, and I'm pleased to say also my former colleague from FIIA. Currently, he's a professor of political science in the University of Turku, director of the FOARC research project funded by Academy of Finland. And he has held various positions during his career already. So we have an excellent set of panelists, and I will now yield the floor to Alex to start up the conversation.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mika. And I think on the introductions, you got one name wrong, but the CV was right. I think you might have been referring to the other Mikael in your sort of second intervention. Thanks, first of all, for inviting me today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. The first point I want to make is just a general thank you actually to the Finnish Institute for International Affairs. I've been following you guys obviously throughout my life, but especially now during the war, and the way in which you guys are able to explain complex issues into the Finnish debate and the international debate is very impressive. I've been listening to all of you from all types of different directions, and I think Mika said at some stage that if there is to be a publicly funded Foreign Affairs Institute which is not able to express itself during a war, then you don't need one. Well, I think there's no one in Finland that now would question your existence. So you guys have been doing a stellar job. So I feel a little bit like an amateur, with the two other panelists on this. So what I'll do is I'll give a little bit of an intro, and as so frequently before, I'll give you 3 points and then a conclusion in the sort of, I think, allotted 10-15 minutes that we've been each given to kick it off with. By way of introduction, I quite often say that we human beings have a tendency to do 3 things. We over-rationalize the past, we over-dramatize the present, and then subsequently underestimate the future. I guess in this particular case, with the war going on, it's very difficult to over dramatize the present. I do think, even as a Finn who is very careful on using the words drama or historic, I mean, this is a dramatic time, and I think with historic consequences. Now, one of the things I find interesting in this whole debate is the sort of over-rationalization of the past. So in many ways, we should be foreign policy experts, but we draw on examples all the time from history. And so we go back into the past and try to rationalize, say, what happened in 1914, or what happened in 1939, what happened in 1989. And then we also over-rationalize the situation in terms of warfare, in the sense that, a lot of us are right now pushing the ticket or the storyline that, this is a proxy war. It's going to, be another Afghanistan. And then we forget to look at, well, could it actually be another Korea instead, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of these sort of examples that we draw from the past that come into a pot, and we're all trying to make sense of it. So I belong very much to the same category. And I should also add that, when I was in office, you had a hell of a lot less time to creatively think about what is going on. I felt that I was only able to do that once in my 8 years in government, and that was a few days after the war in Georgia, with a speech that we churned out in 24 hours called 080808. Other than that, the only time that you had time to reflect was when you're sitting in an airplane and trying to read a book or whatever. So I find this position that I'm in currently a hell of a lot more stimulating than the ones we had before. And it's also much freer. So here we go with my 3 points. The first one is on geoeconomics. The second one is what I call a tripolar +1. And the third one is then on China. And as I said, on China, I'm very timid and very humbled, and looking forward to the panelists after me. So on the geoeconomic side, the reason I think that this sort of conference/seminar conversation that we have is so important, that there are still, and this sounds a little bit funny to say in the middle of the war, but you have in geoeconomics or geopolitical terms, you still have sort of two schools of thought. You have those who are what I call traditionalists, who believe that geopolitics is the only way about it. In other words, tanks, military expenditure, armaments, number of soldiers, the traditional way of looking at things. And geoeconomics is, I shouldn't really care about. And then you have what I call the modern school of thinking, where the notion of geopolitics is much broader. And by that I mean to say that they, including myself, have been thinking about it from the angle that actually nowadays everything has been or can be weaponized, which means that you can weaponize energy, you can weaponize information, you can weaponize human beings, you can weaponize technology, you can weaponize the internet, you can weaponize the economy through sanctions that Mika talked about earlier. And I belong very much into this sort of second category. And as a matter of fact, before the war, I also belong to the category of people who believe that, yes, we have entered an era of unpeace, to use the term from Mark Leonard's book, that because everything is weaponized, it's difficult for us to find the line between war and peace, and that it's actually been blurred. And in a post-Cold War era, you could argue that, yes, there were a few cases of serious conventional warfare, such as Yugoslavia, and I'm talking about Europe here, but most of the time we were moving towards a world where everything was weaponized in one way or another. 9/11 was an example thereof. Post-financial crisis was another example. The information wars used by Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So we went into this very Hobbesian world, where we truly believed that human nature was, well, I guess, nasty, brutish, and short. Life is, at least. and everything became sort of a big mess. And the problem that I find, and I agree with this thinking, but the problem that I find as a scholar, I guess, is that I have a very difficult time in then trying to somehow define what this world means. I can give it a name, but I have absolutely no clue in which direction it's going to go. And I think the war in Ukraine is a good example. I thought it was going to end with another frozen conflict in whatever Luhansk and Donetsk or in the Donbas region, and that was it. And then we continue this sort of, era of unpeace. But sure enough, that didn't happen. And therefore, we move to my second point. My second point is that, again, before the war, my thinking was very much that we're entering, a tripolar world: China, the United States, and Europe. But it was a tripolar plus one world, which meant that you had these sort of three poles, but in different types of instances, you would have a different player coming in. So, when it was about, say, conventional warfare, it would be perhaps Russia, or energy, it would be Russia. Then, in other cases, you would have different players from India, from, Pakistan coming into the game. Then in some cases, you'd have impact coming from the Middle East or the Gulf region, and we'd be sort of looking at different forms of intimidation. And I also thought that we would be seeing a pivot, which was, driven by obviously the two so-called superpowers, China and the US, whereby China is an emerging power, and actually the US a declining power. And we know how emerging powers and declining powers, from rationalizing from the past, we know roughly how they act. But of course, this has changed the situation a little bit. I would, for instance, argue that, the EU was kind of comfortably between the US and China as a regulatory superpower, but now it's become a bit of an acting superpower as well. I used to sometimes upset some of my transatlantic friends to say that, if the US is pivoting to China, and if Europe wants to play serious geopolitics or geoeconomics, it actually needs to play ball with China as well. And the figure that I get: don't turn your back against, hold the hand of the US, but don't turn your back against China. And then I said that 75% of what we do should be transatlantic and value-based, but 25% of the game should be with China. And I know this is a little bit Machiavellian, and I don't say it only because I live 500 meters from Santa Croce, where Machiavelli is buried. But that was my thinking. And you know what? I think that with this war, the geopolitical role of Europe is going to be stronger in this game. I might be a little bit idealistic, but I think it has a lot more skin in the game. And I think the United States obviously understands this better as well. My final and third point before the conclusion is then on China. And this is, where I'm looking at both Mikael and FIIA. And you can nod or shake your head or whatever. Okay, so if I was Xi Jinping, and I have met him twice, I was foreign minister both times. The first one was a courtesy call in Beijing in 2009. Supposed to be 30 minutes, ended up being an hour and a half, and a fascinating conversation about the world at the time. And the second time was in Helsinki, when he came as vice president again for a visit. And out of protocol, he said, I want to see that young Finnish foreign minister chap. And we spent an hour and a half at his residence in Kalastajatorppa, actually. So if I was Xi Jinping right now, I'd probably be thinking two things. One is, well, this conflict is a little bit untimely, because I want to focus on domestic affairs at the moment. And for me, domestic affairs means as containing COVID and trying to make sure that zero COVID policy works. I personally don't think it's going to work, and it's going to blow up. It's just a question of when. Mainland China is going to be Hong Kong, on steroids on this particular one. But trying to contain it, and especially with point two, the coming up of the party congress in October or November, so when his continuation can be coronated, etc. And in any case, they were having enough problems with real estate and etc. And quite happy with actually being able to get up, how would I say, the control mechanisms that you quite often see in if not a digital dictatorship, at least an authoritarian digital society, as we see in China at the moment. So a little bit uncomfortable with what's happening and wanted to focus on something else. The positive side of it, the second thought, I think that Xi Jinping might be thinking, well, conflict in Europe and all this stuff about democracy and governance and values, and it doesn't hurt to have the Americans focused more on Europe at this moment, and going into the midterms in the US, that it's not all about China bashing, that it's more about Russia bashing, etc. etc. So a little bit of a sort of a comfortable thing about it as well. Now, my argument here is that I think China has, and I'm simplifying, oversimplifying, has obviously three options. Option number one is to pivot towards Russia and say, okay, we're going to have these guys as a little bit of a vassal state, and we'll control them. So we'll be the big bosses, and then we have this sort of prince state that is dependent on us for some alimony along the way, and we'll help them a little bit on oil and gas, and perhaps we do have one product that we might want from Russia, and that's nuclear submarines. They're sophisticated in that. They haven't sold them to anyone yet, but perhaps if we do a little bit of stuff. So that's sort of option one. Option number two is to pivot to the West and say, the Belt and Road Initiative is too expensive for us. For us, this is about projecting power, and especially economic power. And in any case, we're a peaceful state. We don't do military kind of stuff, and we'll do that. And as a matter of fact, on Taiwan, we can't sort of play the game at the moment. So let's just be nice with the West and the rest of it. And the third option is to be neutral, right? Or whatever that means. And I know that Mika and I hate it when people talk about, Finnish neutrality. It's completely different neutrality, but sort of not taking a stand on this, that playing the game in a little bit both directions, and avoiding secondary sanctions by playing too much with Russia, but at the same time, making sure that sort of Russia stays there, perhaps a little bit as a thorn in the side. When I say this, and I'll finish off my third point with this, one thing that I do warn against, and we keep on doing all the time, I'm the worst at this. We have such a bloody Western view on this conflict. It's all about navel gazing, and we're looking at things from such a European perspective all the time. And of course, in Finland, with our border with Russia and with real security concerns, it's fully understandable. But we also have to understand that this Eurocentric view of looking at what's going on can be quite detrimental. So, we miss the point when we see the UN voting 141 against Russia. We miss the point that there's a big mass there which abstains. And there's a reason why it abstains. It is because they think that, we are too patronizing and think that we're on the right side of history and still have this worldview that our values are the right ones. My conclusion, I'll just drop it, stop at this then, is to say that I am still struggling to understand what moment this is in history, and probably I won't be able to do that for a while to come. I probably none of us do. I mean, we talked about the post World War I period as the post Great War period, right? Until we came to World War II, and it became the interwar period. And we talked about, the Cold War as a period until it became the post-Cold War period. And now I don't know what we've entered. I really don't know. I'm struggling to find a name. What I can say, and I stop it at this, I do think that we're looking at a moment of great fragmentation in global politics, where the multilateral order that was created post-World War II is facing a new multipolar world, which is not in which it is not able to function properly. Whether it's the UN, whether it's the WTO, the IMF, or the World Bank, Yeah, in Europe, the multilateralism that was created kind of works, but I'm not sure it's going to work in the rest of the world. So therefore, I think that we're not looking at deglobalization, but probably the regionalization of globalization. And if we want to come back to a multilateral world, rule of law and the rest of it, I think we need to rejig the multilateral institutions, actually revolutionize them. The UN, the World Banks and IMFs of this world, so that the rest of the world is represented not by some deal that was made by great powers in Yalta, but by a deal that's probably made in a new kind of a global security conference when this world ends. And therefore, I stop it just with the idea, perhaps the spirit of Helsinki in 2025 could be the right moment. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you, Alex. Excellent insights, and I really liked your 3 points on over rationalizing the past, kind of creating too much of clarity into the situation. As we know, the past rhymes with the present, but it doesn't correlate. There's no causality necessarily there. And then hyperbolizing the present. That's something that we have to also face. You mentioned that how war travels badly. So the further away you are, the more there's kind of a shades of gray, and that is clear if you think about, for example, Indian interpretation of the conflict and how they are seeing it. It always rhymes and travels with your own framework and your regional position. India has a particular regional setting and security environment, and it doesn't share with us the same interpretation as the Europeans have. And then underestimating the future, and that's something that I would like to perhaps quickly return to Alex. I understood that you were referring to kind of not acknowledging in the right time what is actually happening. You referred to your excellent speech 080808 that was meant to be a wake-up call, but it's really bad to be right before one's time. I'm sure that you have realized that. So what do you mean by underestimating the future? This is a rapture point, frame-breaking event, kind of a hegemonic challenge. But what is looming in the front of us that we are perhaps underestimating?
Yeah, very briefly, and sorry, because I think all of our brains are sort of overworking at the moment, and it's horrible to say that in this drama we're actually quite excited in doing all of this analysis. So what do I mean with underestimating the future? The historians in the room can please correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm thinking is that, during World War I, there were already people thinking about the new global order in the form of the state of nations and, the pretext to the United Nations, Monroe Doctrine and all of these things. And the same thing happened during World War II. And I think organizations such as the Finnish Institute for International Affairs needs to have the audacity and the foresight to start doing this analysis. What does the global order look like after this? If we draw the conclusion that we are in this war because Russia felt left out of the European or global security structure post-Cold War, and if it's been calling for a new European or global security structure, and its calls haven't been called, and the reason is quite simple, because it would have been centered on Russia. So, but in any case, so that's what I'm trying to say, is that we need to start thinking strategically. Okay, what happens if this war? What happens when this war is over? How do we get how do we get India? How do we get Africa? How do we get South America on board into a new sort of global community? Because we're clearly seeing this is not working at the moment. So that's what I'm trying to say. And I simply don't have the answer. I just find it, fascinating to try to figure it out. But I don't have an answer what it would look like. Well, I do, but I'm a little bit too idealistic on what can be achieved.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you for your words of support when it comes to the institute itself. It is an independent entity under the umbrella of the Finnish Parliament, and it is very carefully firewalled in order to be dazzles and bold. We are not shying away from the task, and we will carry it on. That's for sure. But thank you for that. Very much appreciated. And let's turn to Anthea next and listen to what she is going to clarify to us.
So first of all, sorry that my PowerPoint came up partway through the last discussion. I didn't realize that was going to happen. We were practicing ahead of time, but it was taking a long time for it to upload. So I started the upload process and it worked much faster this time. So apologies there. Really, really interesting to hear the introduction. I completely agree with Alex's point that the Finnish Institute has been very ahead of the game on this one. So it's a real honor to be here tonight. And also to hear from Alex, who obviously has incredible expertise on this. So what I wanted to do was cover 3 different issues in my talk today. I was going to do 2 and skip the background, but I was told, no, it's helpful to give some of the background. So I'm going to start with just a brief sketch of some of what we've already heard, which is what I think of as the shifting economic orders because of the geopolitical contestation. Then I want to give a bit of a focus on technology competition, particularly between the US and China. And finally, I want to talk about weaponized interdependence, which is obviously really critical at the moment when we're thinking about both what Russia is doing, but also the Western reactions to what's happening with Russia. So let me start with the first one about shifting economic orders. And you can see here a globe that's all being blown apart, because this was very much my experience. Because I started as an international economic lawyer who came of age in the 1990s. And was very much part of this neoliberal economic order that happened in the post-Cold War period. And this is the one that very much teaches you that economic interdependence is a way for both peace and prosperity. And so if I were to distill some of the sort of core ideas from the neoliberal economic order, you would have, first of all, a very strong predominance of an economic mindset, so a very strong focus on win-win outcomes and absolute economic gains. You would also have a focus, much less of a focus on security. So it wasn't that security was absent from that particular order, but it was the justification for the order that through trade and investment, you will not just have greater prosperity, but you will also have peace. So it was a justification for interdependence. And it was also an exception to all of the trade and investment treaties, but it was an exception that wasn't the rule and was never used. And so it sort of was at the beginning and it was at the end, but it was not the center. The center of the field was very much the economic mindset. And it was one that really saw economic interdependence because of this economic lens. It saw interdependence as opportunity, an opportunity to ensure that we could all do what we do best and to create much greater economic efficiency and absolute gains for everybody. And so several years ago, I started to think we were sort of entering into what I was thinking of as an emerging geoeconomic order. And so I asked myself if I were to distill what the sort of fundamental differences between these 2 orders were. The first was there was a much stronger shift in focus away from absolute gains and win-win kind of understandings towards a much greater focus on relative gains. And with this, a different understanding of the relationship between peace and trade. So the old order very much says you have trade and that gives you peace, whereas this order starts to say maybe you need peace in order to have trade, and that peace was actually the precondition that allowed the kind of multilateral order. It wasn't the consequence of it. What we start to see in this shift is instead of seeing interdependence primarily through the lens of opportunity, we start to see many people starting to think much more of it through the lens of vulnerability and how it can be weaponized. And finally, what we see, and this started quite a few years ago, is we start to see very frequent invocations of national security exceptions in economic relations and very, very wide invocations. So to apply to a much broader range of things than we had previously. And that's in trade and investment agreements, export controls. And so instead of it being the exception that nobody uses, it becomes the exception that swallows the rule. And if you think about why there is this sort of shift in the order, and I'm going to do this with a particular US-China lens, though of course there are other actors that are relevant to it. So one one of the reasons is, of course, you've got a closing of the gap between the US and China. So in absolute terms, both the US and China gained in absolute terms from economic globalization. But China used this period to close the gap on the United States economically, militarily, and technologically. And that has pricked very strong security and geopolitical security concerns from the United States. We also see for the first time a convergence from the US of their economic and security competitors. So in the Cold War, they obviously had a security competitor in the USSR, but it was not really an economic competitor, and it was not sufficiently economically strong to be a competitor. And so you had a securitized mindset, but not so interlinked with economics. You also, during the Cold War, actually had Japan emerge as a major economic challenger of the United States, but here we had an economic challenger that was not a security challenger. So we had economic and security challenges, but in very different realms. Whereas here, the US is interpreting China as both an economic and security challenge. So we're seeing a different configuration. And this is also happening in a period of deep economic integration and digital connectivity. And that's obviously very unlike the Cold War. Not only do we have digital connectivity in a way we never did in that period, but also obviously the Soviet Union and the Western world were not economically integrated at all in the way we see the world is now and the way US and China are. I should say, of course, that this is a perspective that is also shifting in China. So if you see, for example, Gewitt's views on elite Chinese views, there is, of course, a multiplicity of views in China about how to understand economic interdependence. And he identifies three main views, but those views are also shifting in weight over time. So the three views are, one is that economic interdependence is positive. It's an engine of economic development and technological growth, so a very positive win-win aspect. The second is it's a source of risk because it creates dependencies and vulnerabilities, so that's the win-lose idea. And the final is that it can be a source of leverage because it can create dependency and vulnerabilities of others, which is very much that Belt and Road aspect. And what Gewitt says, if you look at elite Chinese views, is that even though you've seen all three of them be around for a while, it used to be the case that number one was clearly dominant, whereas now what we're seeing is number one is receding and numbers 2 and 3 are becoming more dominant than they were previously. And so this is just a bit of a sense of some of the shifts in mental model that are happening in various countries around the globe with a particular focus on the US and China. So how might this be playing out then in the second point that I want to talk about, which is technology competition? So if we take technology competition, I think it's useful to think about the US and China because they're really the duopoly when it comes to global technology. So there are many other technological players, but they're really sort of out ahead in a way that few others are. And so what is the US's position? Well, the US has been the technological leader. And so its incentive has been to try to preserve its leadership position, which means that it often wants to restrain access to technology leaking or moving across to a competitor. China, on the other hand, in the last few decades has been on the catch up. So it has not been as much of a technological innovator over the last few decades, but it has been on a process of catching up technologically, and it wants to catch up to the United States and in fact lead and best the United States in a number of areas. So whereas the US has a desire to restrain access to a technology, China has a desire to acquire knowledge and technologies. And if you understand that basic configuration, then you can start to think about the strategies that each of them are using. So China for the last few decades has been using what some of my colleagues here, I run the Geoeconomic group at the ANU. So some of my colleagues, Andy Kennedy and Darren Lim, would say they have the strategies of making, taking, and transacting. So what are these strategies? Well, first of all, when it comes to technology, they want to be better at making it themselves. And so we really see there the push to indigenize technological development so that they can do it onshore and not have to be worried about being dependent on the US or semiconductors, etc. And we've seen that move developing for quite a long time, but has been really hypercharged by the geoeconomic developments. We also see that they have a desire for transacting. So transacting means using financial means to buy technological power. And so one of the things we saw leading up to these tensions was that Chinese companies and Chinese state-owned enterprises had actually gone around the world buying many different technology makers in a way to use lawful and financial means to acquire technological knowledge. And finally, we have taking. So whereas transacting is done with money, taking is done without money, which is also a way of acquiring technological advantage now or material. Taking can be lawful or unlawful. So an example of lawful taking are huge downloads from all of the repositories of scientific journals, etc. This is perfectly lawful and happens all the time. But it's also unlawful. So the use of cyber espionage to steal materials is an example of unlawful taking. If these are the kind of strategies that China has been using to try to catch up and lead in technology, what strategies do we see the US using? So several years ago, I and a number of colleagues wrote a piece where we said, in response to these three strategies from the US, from China, we should expect to see the US doing three things: shielding, stifling, and spurring. So what are they? So shielding is trying to protect their technological assets at home. And where we see that happening is with investment screening, for example, that stops Chinese companies being able to transact into Silicon Valley and into places like that to acquire technology purchases, to shield what the US has at home. And so we've seen a massive uptick in that. The second is we're likely to see stifling. And so stifling is not just about protecting your technology lead at home, it's also about trying to stifle China's technological advance abroad. And if you look at the way the US has approached, for example, Huawei, one way you could say it is stifling, another you could say it is kneecapping, but either way, it is about trying to undermine their technological advancement through their companies. And the final one is spurring. So spurring is the idea that you not only have to protect what you've got and try to undercut the other one, but you also need to try to make sure that you maintain your lead and you keep running faster. And so what we see now is a much more of an emphasis on putting money into research and development, to active industrial policy. And that's really changing what we see in the US and elsewhere. Now, how might this kind of play out with some of our, the way that states are sort of measuring this? So if you think about a national interest function, you're going to need to be weighing both your absolute economic gains that come from economic interdependence, but sometimes also your strategic relative losses, depending on whether you're the US and you've got somebody that's catching up with you. And a very good graph I saw that helps me to explain what I think the dynamic is actually comes from Jonathan Tucker back in 1991. He's not talking about countries, he's not talking about the US and China. He's actually talking about what happens when you have two technology companies, a leader and an up-and-comer, and whether or not they have an incentive to cooperate with each other on technology. And so what he basically says is, if you look at it from the perspective of the technology leader, which is here the equivalent of the United States, then in terms of economic gain, in terms of absolute gains, the economic payoff is you actually do much better if you cooperate, even if the other party isn't as good as you. We know from open innovation, we know from opening our borders, we know from all sorts of research and development that openness and interaction and exchange really enhances creativity and breakthroughs. And so you have an economic gain if you are the US and China and you're working with each other. Even if the US is further ahead, it will still get something from working with the very good Chinese scientists. But what we also know from technology companies is if you have a leader and an up-and-comer, if they collaborate, the up-and-comer tends to close the gap on the leader. And that's a strategic loss that happens over time. So they may start out as 10th, and then they may become 5th, and they may become 3rd in the market, and they become 2nd, and they get closer and closer and closer to that lead. And so this means that over time, there is a relative security loss from the perception of the United States, not from the perspective of China. They have an economic gain and a security gain, but from the perspective of the US. And so when I started working on this, it seemed to be very clear that the economists tended to be only looking at the line above, where they were saying we have to have economic interdependence and technological collaboration because we get win-win outcomes, which is true. And many of the security people I knew were only looking at the bottom. One, saying, if we do this, they'll catch up with us, and that's a security risk, and so they didn't want to do it, which is, there is also some truth to that. And of course, a national interest function needs to integrate those two things. And this is the way they actually integrate these two things, which is, for the most part, for a very, very long time, actually, it remains in your advantage to keep collaborating. But at some point, it starts to sharply turn. And I think this is what we have seen in the US in terms of their internal mental model. I'm not saying that this is accurate for what is the reality of the situation. There are many things that might suggest that this model doesn't perfectly transpose, but I think it actually mentally captures the mental model of why the US is reacting in the way that they are. And so at the beginning of COVID, I taught geoeconomics at Harvard to students that were all around the world, including 5 fantastic students that were in China. And one of them, when I showed this particular graphic, said that's really interesting because in China, they talk about there being 3 or 4 distinct phases in the US-China technology relationship. And she said, I think I could I think I could locate those phases on your graph. So here's how it went. The first one was back 1979 to 1989. You have sort of early exploration and you're sort of coming up the curve. 1990 to 2010 was a period of stable development. They were getting closer and closer and many very good gains on both sides. From 2010 to 2016, we saw much more in-depth engagement technologically between researchers in the US and researchers in China. But this is the same period that we started to see increased concerns about things like cyber espionage and the rise of China. And then after 2016, I think this is where we get into the new uncertainties, the new stage, and this is very much Trump coming in. But that real shift that we see in the establishment in the US, which is now bipartisan, towards very much starting to see this more in terms of relative gains. And I think that captures quite accurately the trajectory of that particular relationship. Where does this go from here? So I think one of the big questions looking forward is how bifurcated or otherwise are the technology systems going to be between the two different countries? And here I just want to highlight a report, I think from last year from Brookings, and just highlight 2 findings that I think are particularly interesting for our consideration. So this was a report where they interviewed like CEOs and people who are in technology companies across a variety of countries in Asia, in the West, particularly in the US, particularly in China. And they asked them a number of questions. So one of the questions I think is interesting is they asked them the question, do you think US restrictions with respect to China in terms of technology, do you think it's going to get more restrictive or less restrictive? So 97%, the first 3 big graphs there, 97% thought it was going to be increased restrictions. Increased across all technologies, increased across some technologies, but increased. It was only 3% that thought you were going to see decreased restrictions. So very much the assumption is we're moving into a world that it's going to get more restrictive than it currently is, and it's become much more restrictive, obviously, in recent years. But here's the interesting one after that. They were then asked, what is your strategy in dealing with this increased clampdown and geoeconomic competition and attempts to bifurcate more in technology? And I think their answers are really interesting. And I think it'd be also really interesting to ask the same question in 5 years and 10 years to see what the shift is. So out of the total respondents, we've got US firms, China firms, and firms based in other countries. So only a couple, like about 1% of each, thought that they would align with a US sphere of influence. Even less, but about 1% thought that they would align with a Chinese sphere of influence. A good about a third, 33%, thought that they would try to remain neutral between the US and China. So they were going to try and sit on the fence. And amazingly, I think about 66% thought that they were going to try to make an advantage gain out of this by playing both sides off against each other. And I think this is a really interesting. So when I present to governments and when I present to companies, I think they're often in very different headspaces and they don't really fully understand each other's headspaces. I think the world that I think we're likely to end up in is going to be somewhere in between those 2 different headspaces. So when I present this, for example, to some security people, they're just like, these tech companies, they're dreaming, pick a side. Whereas when I present to some of the business community, I think there's often still a kind of like, well, we need to find ways, we need to make it through. And I think the reality is going to be somewhere between those 2 positions. It'll be interesting to play that. The final thing that I was going to present on today, which is very relevant given the economic sanctions, the sort of weaponization of gas and everything we're seeing in the Ukraine, is this idea of weaponized interdependence. And many will be very familiar with the idea of weaponized interdependence, which has really come to the fore through Farrell and Newman, where they say that our interconnected world is not flat. You're going to have these core nodes that are controlled by states, and the states that have real power over those central nodes, they're going to be able to weaponize them. And how are they going to be able to weaponize them? So Farrell and Newman say they're going to be able to do the panopticon effect, which is they're going to be able to use those to spy. And so we see the US, for example, very clearly doing that over things like its PRISM program. And that's why there are very strong concerns also about Huawei and 5G, that anybody who has control of digital connectivity and 5G networks, whether US or China, will have an amazing ability of the panopticon spying effect. And the other thing they say is that you will be able to do chokeholds. You'll be able to turn things on and off. So for 5G, that would be able to turn off supplies, or in fact, as some governments said to me, they're less concerned about just turning off, because then that's really obvious. They're more concerned about gradual degrading and making things inconsistent, because it's not enough to make you change your 5G networks. It's plausibly deniable, but it creates enormous stress and anxiety within states. So it may be choke point, it may be degrading, we're not sure. But the idea is that you can control central networks if you are in control of those central hubs. But the thing is, those hubs are different depending on which area you are in. And so there's not one speed of globalization. We see many different patterns of connectivity. I'm going to give you 2 patterns, but I'd be particularly interested to see a 3rd pattern at the moment with Russia, which is the energy pattern. But let me give you first the trade pattern and the finance pattern. So in the trade pattern, the 2 biggest hubs are China and the US. And we can see in the gray here a number of others, which are sort of European ones, which are split out. If you put those together, they would be a 3rd big hub. But we see here China and the US as really central trading partners for other states. And sort of the bigger your circle and the more central it is, the bigger you are as a node within the network, and all the lines out are your connections to the other countries. Now, this is really important because if you want to think about strategies, geoeconomic strategies, states weaponize what they're strong on. So we really clearly see China weaponizing its trading links, and Australia is a very good example of that, that when Australia has done things to upset China, China has responded by stopping exports in 10 different industries. And we also see that with Lithuania. And the US is also really clearly doing that now. It's doing it with Russia, it's doing it with export controls, it's doing it in a variety of ways. So we see that states weaponize the powers that they have. But states, even great powers, have different powers. So if we look across at financial networks, in financial networks, China is almost not to be seen. The big one here that has so much control is actually the US. That's the big pink one you can see there. China is the itty bitty little blue one underneath it, because China is not central in the global financial networks. And so when the US wants to weaponize through things like SWIFT, which is cutting off some of the financial network connectivity, they are incredibly well positioned to do that, and China is not. Now, what does this mean? Well, I think if you line these 2 graphs of connectivity up next to each other, so you've got the trade one on the left and you've got the finance one on the right, to me, this is a pretty good map for thinking about our past, our present, and our future. So why do I say our past? Well, this particular difference, I think, is how we really, as a world, got through the global financial crisis. And that's because in the financial crisis, you really had the US and also Europe kind of go down, but China was not very centrally connected into global financial markets. And so it was not nearly as affected by the global financial crisis. But at the same stage, China was incredibly central in the world trading system, and it was able to supercharge some of the trading stuff and some of its infrastructure spending and some of its sort of production in the post-2008 period. So really, this particular configuration was part of what got us through the global financial crisis as well as we got through it. That's the past. What about our present? Well, I think this present now, you're very clearly seeing this in some of the geoeconomic moves that I've alluded to already. So you're seeing the weaponization on both sides of China and the US on trade, and we're seeing the very strong weaponization of SWIFT by the US in a whole variety of circles that they've been doing it, but now very clearly with respect to Russia. What does this mean for our future? It strikes me that if you're China and you're looking at this map, and if you're China and you're watching the economic coercion and SWIFT sanctions and everything that's happened to Russia, you cannot stand the look of that second diagram. And that in 10 to 20 years' time, you cannot handle the idea that you could be subject to that level of US power in the global financial markets. And so my guess is that that particular one is something that we've had in the past. It's something we've got in the present. But if you look towards China wanting to find ways to not be as dependent on the dollar and to find alternatives, for me, this is the graph that explains that. There's much more that I can say, but why don't I pause there and let others come in? But thank you very much.
Thank you. That was simply fascinating. I love those overviews and bringing clarity in a way that doesn't clarify too much, kind of oversimplify matters, kind of giving you a leeway of kind of combining things in different ways. Let me just remind everybody that you know, I'm sure that there's quite a lot of in the audience that finds themselves stimulated by this presentation, so you can post questions in the chat functions of the Teams platform. So put your questions and comments there, and then we will have a chance to have a round of responses and reflections by the panelists. But let me just quickly ask you a question that has to do with your kind of a starting point, that we are living in times when the logic of interdependence is reversing. So it was basically peace through trade, and now it seems to be that you need to have peace and security in order to have trade. So you need to have safe and sheltered trade. And so kind of reflecting on what Alex brought along, you know, the ideas concerning the future and possible also balances in the future. How do you see kind of the possible end game? Is there some balance and order that you can see in the future through your overviews?
So let me just say, I'll just show you one other diagram which I think might be interesting for this. Just bear with me while I get it up. So what I've presented here is very much a juxtaposition between what we would call the establishment view, which was that win-win approach, and the geoeconomic view. One thing I should make clear, and I didn't say it in this talk, is that I published a book last year on 6 Faces of globalization, which was actually not just about the establishment position and the geoeconomic position, but was about 6 different narratives about economic globalization, including those 2, but also including multiple others. And one of the things I think it's really important to do is to realize that the establishment position, I think, has been challenged in many ways, but I don't think it has been replaced by the geoeconomic one. I think, let me just move across here, sorry. I think we're actually going to see a variety of narratives coming together. And sort of the future, I think, is going to be a lot more to do with how you see the constellation of these different narratives. And I don't think we're going to end up with deglobalization exactly, but I think we're going to end up with more regionalization in some areas, but less in other areas. And so just let me give you one example of how some of these different narratives line up. And this is an issue that we've seen become relevant recently, which is a real push in China, in the US, and also in Europe to do national self-reliance with respect to reshoring of semiconductor manufacturing. So we've seen this as a real push for reshoring, but we haven't seen a push for such a push for reshoring across all areas. This is considered to be sort of a critical area where we're seeing it, but we're not sure if it's going to go much further than that. But one reason we thought that it was likely to happen in this area, at least first, and then the question will be what else it extends to, is that this particular one is a policy that's actually supported by at least 3 different narratives, but for different reasons. So we start, for example, with a right-wing protectionist narrative that's been very strong in the United States, and they want to reshore all manufacturing because they want to rebuild domestic capacity in manufacturing, and that includes semiconductors, but it includes a lot of other things too. You've also, after COVID-19, you've got a very strong resilience narrative coming to the fore in many countries. And resilience is really about ensuring supplies and capacity in essential sectors. And so that includes PPE, but it also includes semiconductor manufacturing, but it doesn't include many of the manufacturing things that the right-wing protectionists are interested in. And then you have the geoeconomic narrative, which is not just about resilience, but it's also about building capacity in strategic areas and not being dependent on your foe. So China not depending on the US not depending on China. And that also supports not being dependent with respect to a strategic sector like semiconductor manufacturing. And so what we see in those sorts of areas is they, for different reasons, all overlap on the idea of reshoring semiconductors to these major players, but they disagree on some of the others. So for example, if you look at some of the moves towards diversification and ally shoring, this is one where as long as you're ally shoring with your non-strategic competitor, it's something that can suit the geoeconomic narrative and the resilience narrative, but really it does nothing for your right-wing populist narrative. Your right-wing populist narrative don't care about manufacturing going back to friends overseas instead of enemies, they care about it coming home to themselves. So I just say this to sort of say, I think we're going to see a multi-speed approach where some things are going to be less globalized and some things are still going to be globalized. And I think there are a lot of different reasons behind that. But one of the things I think we need to be careful of is, to me, it's not establishment view or geoeconomic view. These two views are one of at least 6, and I would say multiple others. And it's actually going to be the overlaps and alliances between these different views that help to define what the configuration will be going forward.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate your point about kind of the path dependencies on these different trends and trajectories. So there's also kind of ideological and political components. Different strategic cultures see and view things differently, and we have to take that into consideration in the kind of abstract modeling of things. That one of the lessons I think everybody learned from the Ukraine is that kind of the rational choice models didn't work that well. You know, they saw the war as nonsensical for all the parties involved. So we need to kind of bring the kind of the culture and the history a little bit to the foreground in order to understand why certain processes, regressive negative processes can happen, and also how positive processes can be enabled. So thank you very much, and let's move on. Yes.
Can I just say on that, I think you're absolutely right on that. And I think we're seeing two different dynamics playing out. One is within Russia and one is between Russia and the West. So one of the things that was really obvious when we did the study of the different narratives was that the liberal elite Western view, which is very much that rational choice model that you're talking about, that's economic, they really struggled and didn't understand the cultural motivations behind the right-wing protectionist narrative. They assumed it was just that people had been economically left behind and they were being hoodwinked by cultural values and everything. But a lot of it was that they actually couldn't hear and listen to that type of approach. It was such a different mindset. So you see this playing out both between the West and Russia at the moment, but also the Russian elite to Russian masses. So the first is you're really seeing that the West is able to understand what Russia's doing through geopolitics and through this, but really has trouble talking about like ideology and the importance of like culture or language or the psyche. It's something that they sort of don't understand, and so they kind of pretend isn't happening and assume that it's happening for something else. So we are debilitated in terms of our understandings on that front. But also I'm seeing really interesting reports in the Russian media saying that same kind of liberal elite in Russia was too disdainful to talk to the Russian majorities that were getting a lot of the propaganda and everything. And you have that same sort of elite sort of masses or liberal masses disconnect that we saw in the US lead to Trump also happening in Russia. So I think that sort of inability to kind of put yourself in the mindset of others is playing out horizontally and vertically.
Yes, excellent point. Good. Let's turn to Mikael Matlin. So floor is yours.
Thank you. The mystery man behind the CV. I'm also very fascinated to be on this excellent panel, a very interesting choice of speakers, and thank you for the invitation. I need to ask Marie-Louise to run the slides since we had some technical problems here. There are actually some interesting subtle hints in our first slides. If we compare Anthe's first slide in the background of that to mine, Anthe had a lot denser connections in the network on that picture, whereas mine is quite quite different. So I don't know if Anthe's was kind of our past globalization, and mine is more sort of future regionalization, as Alex would have put it. So I guess my role sort of on this panel is to focus a bit more on China and to get a bit out of the Western navel gazing, as Alex put it, on this issue of geoeconomics. Together with my namesake, Mikael Vigel, we co-edited a special issue on geoeconomics already some 6 or 7 years ago. And since then, I mean, the world has definitely taken a major geoeconomic turn. That's pretty clear. So while it's clear that it's important to study and understand this phenomenon, I've also been a bit conflicted about it, specifically sort of about the responsibility that we as scholars and practitioners have in not making the global plight worse than it already is. I'm kind of taking a tangent here from the other Mikael, who in the opening remarks raised this fundamental dilemma of are we sort of sleepwalking into economic warfare? So I'll focus a bit more on China here. I based my talk on recent research done by others and by myself on China. Next slide, please. Yeah, so on this geoeconomics, the sort of definition of the concept, I mean, it goes back, as we all, or most of us know, to Luttwak's writing in the early 90s, and he talked about zero-sum sort of competition. The states, this is what states do, they compete with each other on the global stage, and post-Cold War, the competition is going to be more used or sort of done with economic means. There is an inherent sort of logic of conflict there. Domestic utility, tech innovations, maximizing domestic benefits. So a lot of the stuff that, for example, Ante was referring to in her presentation was already there. Now, there was this period in between when there was a lot of confusion about what geoeconomics is and what it isn't. There are a lot of different definitions out there talking about different things. And some of the clearest ones that I've found myself are Mikael's simple phrase that it's the geostrategic use of economic power, and later on Chatham House had a similar one with the use of economic tools to advance geopolitical objectives. Now, these are the clearest ones, but I also, at least to my mind, it sets sort of the bar fairly high in terms of the objectives. What are sort of geopolitical, geostrategic objectives, and do we really have a state that is actively in pursuit of such objectives? So there's an academic cottage industry of books on China's grand strategy and China's supposed coming dominance, and I guess it was started at least by Martin Schacht's book, which came out I think 2009 already, When China Rules the World, and one of the latest ones here. Yeah, so the Rush Doshi had a book recently about the long game, China's grand strategy to displace American order. So we've had loads of different books talking about or seeing sort of China somehow going inevitably towards economic, political, whatever dominance. And in some areas, it's more reasonable, I guess, to assume that there are some geopolitical or geostrategic objectives behind this. For example, if we talk about what has been happening in the South China Sea, or the BRI would probably fall within there. But is there sort of an overall grand strategy or grand plan behind it, as Rush Doshi seems to be saying? And I'm again taking a cue from Alex here. I mean, Alex said that we tend to over-rationalize the past, and also you talked a little bit about your own sort of experiences with working in politics, and this is what troubles me a little bit. I mean, people who have been in politics have seen how it works and know sort of the time pressures and things come up, events happen. You can't sort of plan necessarily ahead very long because the world changes and things just happen. So there's this general messiness of politics and well, you know what I say about military strategy is the strategies go out the window when the war starts. And the same tends to happen, I guess, also in politics, where you might have a great political strategy, but then politics happens and that flies out the window. And somehow we seem to be assuming that this doesn't apply to China. That China just has this massive sort of train that is on a set track towards world dominance. And I just find it a little bit sort of I'm skeptical about sort of this general notion that there's this grand plan behind everything. So next slide, please. Yes. So I talked 2 years ago in a paper about how there's been this massive Gestalt shift, borrowing a term from psychology, on how we view Chinese investments in Europe. And I guess more broadly that same applies also to sort of how we see China in general. I mean, this is extraordinary if you have followed it a couple of years back or 10, 20 years ago, how we talked about, for example, Chinese investments. Just a few years ago in Finland, we had a completely different view on Chinese investments and broadly sort of welcoming Chinese investments. So I couldn't find this nice picture here of a benign panda turning into a fiery dragon if you look at it from a different angle, as I had to use this classical duck and rabbit thing. But it really seemed to sort of capture, to my mind, sort of this shift in thinking about it, about China. But to me, at least, if you want to really understand sort of China's use of geoeconomics, arguably you need to also understand how China's political system functions and what kinds of motivations drive its leaders in their use of power. So next slide, please. So I take this from a book that is just coming out. So I'm talking a little bit my book, so to speak, or our book. We have a book coming out in just over a week's time on China's political system, and this is unfortunately in Finnish because it's a direct screenshot from that book. But this is basically a sort of simple sketch that I've used a number of years. I think it's more than 10 years since I used it the first time to try to explain to people how, in my view, sort of the security spheres go when you talk about China's foreign policy, and how it looks from the perspective of Beijing. And in the center, there is always the position of the party, the power of the party, and the, if you want to call it regime security or protecting sort of the nature of the regime, that's always central. And very closely linked to that, you have a national unity, and that tends to translate into the quote-unquote core interests that China has. So in Western China, in Taiwan, in the South China Sea, and so on. And then you have sort of this concentric circles going out from there. You have sort of the near abroad, the closest areas, and the stability in that area. And then you can come to the more sort of economic, sort of general global economic stability, and furthest out you have the kind of stuff that we were talking about 10, 15 years ago when we talked about security. I mean, this kind of broad conception of security, where you had problems of migration and more recently talking about, a lot about climate change and so on, these kinds of issues. So a lot of these things, when you look at how China reacts, I think still go back to this sort of basic thing. I haven't seen a major change there. And when you try to, for example, understand now how China, I mean, the big question here, how is China going to act on Ukraine and so on? I can think of at least 7 different, I mean, immediately 7 different sort of things that make the Ukraine war very tricky for China, and many of those go back basically to the center of this sketch here. So whether it's sort of how it affects sort of the balance between in the strategic triangle between China, United States, and Russia. If you look at it through the lens of the Taiwan issue, if you think about the upcoming party congress and securing Xi Jinping's 3rd term, if you look at the political rhetoric, all of the baggage that China has in its foreign policy rhetoric about NATO, about the United States, about Russia, and so on. So, save for a few, I would say that most of that sort of argues against China, at least aligning very clearly with the West on this issue. Next slide, please. So I will talk a little bit my latest book, or basically I won't talk very much anymore about it because that's just from the book. But this is our attempt to sort of explain China's political system, and this is the first Finnish language sort of comprehensive book on China's political system, coming out in early April. So next slide, please. So I did another paper that came out just less than a year ago, where I looked at China's use of economic means for political objectives, mind you. So I didn't say geopolitical, but more broadly sort of political objectives. And I looked at the debate on that, this scholarly debate, and the kinds of issues that have been discussed over the years. And you can see at least sort of 4 different discussions here. The first one possibly was this issue of dollar diplomacy, and that was very much related, of course, to the Taiwan issue and the One China principle / policy, depending on where you sit. So that's something that we've seen sort of for a couple of decades already. And then you've had this big discussion around bilateral lending, and that's of course a very big issue since it's a central element basically of PRC foreign economic policy. And most of the world has received Chinese loans in one form or another. So it makes it potentially a potent tool of foreign policy. And this whole issue became, of course, during the Trump administration, very politicized. We had this talk about debt trap diplomacy and so on. And we actually came out with already in the early 2010s. We came out with a colleague of mine up with another concept that we call emergent conditionality, and I think it talks similarly about similar things to this debt trap diplomacy is a very different argument. So basically, we were saying that yes, there might be this kind of conditionality emerging from the way that you have many different Chinese organizations interacting in countries, for example, in Africa or Southeast Asia. And in particular, if the target country is relatively small, it might become a major factor that does affect economic policy. It becomes restraining on the economic policy choices that country has. But the crucial difference was that we did not say, and I still don't think that's the case, that it's part of one sort of a large strategy, sort of central strategy for achieving this kind of dependence. And actually recently there's been some very sort of comprehensive studies on these issues, one by Chatham House. There was another out just a few months ago. And they broadly sort of lend credence, I think, to what we were arguing already then, that it's a much more mixed picture. If you look at it empirically, if you go to the actual places and look in detail, meticulously at what is happening there, you have poor planning on both on the side of the lender and the ones taking the funding, and you have all kinds of different interests in there, but it's hard to sort of come or define this sort of smoking gun of where is the grand plan. Then you had this whole discussion of the BRI, and this is where I think arguably you have the best case for saying that we have something that you could call geostrategy in the making. So it can be understood as a kind of regional ordering. China attempts to redefine the shared goals and values for the region of Eurasia, and to sort of socialize other regional states into its own values and have their consent to leadership. That's one way to put it, as one paper recently said. And then we have the fourth sort of big debate has been on coercive economic diplomacy. And most recently, the talk has been about Lithuania and Australia, but before that, we had, for example, Norway and so on. So you can identify these sort of these 4 different discussions here. Next slide, please. So in the same paper, I also argued actually, apart from these 4 ways that China has used economic means to further some kind of political objectives, you can also see that actually one of the more fundamental challenges, I think, and one of the things that is driving some of the changes is that China, by just being such a major actor, a major economy that does things differently, has sort of shifted the discussion on a lot of issues. And I'm not saying necessarily it's shifted it sort of intentionally or tried to do that, but just because China is doing things differently, it is changing subtly in conjunction with all the other things that are happening, changing the way we see things that we thought we had as kind of settled norms. So I have several examples in the paper. This is a table directly extracted from the paper. So, I mean, on development aid, for example, the thinking started to shift, I think, already maybe 10, 15 years ago among Western donors as well, and very much sort of prompted by the by the fact that China was doing things differently with few upfront aid conditionalities, having aid as an integral part of broader investment and trade relations, and that's now sort of also in the West has been catching on, this kind of way of thinking. On the free capital account convertibility as a precondition for inclusion in the IMF's special drawing rights basket, again, China was arguing that partial capital account convertibility is sufficient, certain capital controls are appropriate, and that has also one ground, although not so much necessarily because of China, but that view is now more sort of accepted. The open trade regime, this is of course where China takes a very different view on it, but arguably China has been protecting some of its strategic industries and key domestic markets, and now we're seeing the same kinds of things happening also in the West. On upholding market competition, again, we have had decades of active industrial policies favoring national state-owned champions in China. And the whole distinction between state and private sector, that was more clear until China entered WTO, and it's been a big debate in those circles since then. So final slide, please. So I end up with sort of are we going into or descending into a kind of geoeconomic vortex? And this is of course a reference now to Henry Kissinger's famous book Diplomacy from 1994. He talked about the military doomsday machine and how sort of just the technicalities of mobilizing with rail from Russia, for example, and or Germany, for that matter, to the front, started to drive the sort of the way of thinking of diplomats and political decision makers. And this is where my concerns lie. So I'm linking up again with what Mikael said. Are we sliding into this kind of economic warfare logic of events? So has China been engaging in geoeconomics? So yes, if we take it to mean this Luttwak's sort of original understanding, yes. But if we want to make a broader claim that there's this sort of there are some overarching geostrategic or geopolitical objectives, I think we need to be much more discerning and really go into each issue and each case and look at it, because sometimes there's a good case for that, other times less good case, arguably. So actually, much of the examples when I talked about sort of how China has used economic means for political objectives, a lot of those examples are either in response to what China perceives as Western dominance of the system, or in response to Western actions that go against China's core interests, the ones that I mentioned earlier. So China has been very reactive, to my mind, in many areas. And we talk about China's coercive economic diplomacy, but looking at it from China's perspective, in many ways, or most cases, it's just reacting to something that it perceives as sort of attacking its core interests. And now the irony is that China is now reacting also to this pressure that it feels coming from the West, especially since the Trump administration. So if you now look at sort of China's economic policies and the way they talk about these things, the thinking has gotten a lot more security oriented from what it was 10 years ago. So China is definitely kind of taking a cue as well from the kinds of actions and discussions in the West, and shifting its own thinking, as I think Ante also showed in this debates in China, they are shifting. So we end up easily in this Hobbesian world, as Alex said, and Beverly Crawford talked already in 1994, I think it was, of the economic security dilemma that is inherent in globalist production exchange networks when you have the context of states that continue to strive for security through military means. So I think I'll stop there, but that was basically my more than 3 points, actually. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Very good. You mentioned the word vortex, and being at high CDD and scholar myself, that word is very familiar to me. Kinesis magister and the downwards spiraling processes and regressive events. But let's go to questions. I received one email from the audience, and it seems that what is on people's mind, of course, is Russia related, and it used to be that from Washington, Russia was viewed as a function of the China relations. So during the Trump years, there was an attempt, kind of a Kissingerian attempt to have one of the Eurasian great powers to align with US, and Russia was approached. But now it seems that China relations is becoming a function of the Russia relationship that the West has. So from your angle, all three of you, how do you see this game? Was Russia a little bit kind of too aggressive and forward-leaning in its start of the process that is difficult to control, and it is messy, and it's not looking very harmonious from China's point of view? So how would you approach that question, kind of the China's position in this particular geopolitical, geoeconomic situation? So Alex, if you could start.
Sure, I'll try to give it a stab. I think I tried to do that in my third point earlier. Before I answer though, can I just I guess both, but Anthea, not only did I love your 3 points every time, which music to my ears, but there's one issue that I have with your graphs, the balls and things like that. Please deal with the European Union as one entity when it comes to geoeconomics. I mean, I just see this all over the place and all the time. And you have to remember that the European Union has a common currency. It has exclusive competence in monetary policy. So when you look at, dollar versus euro, it's the European Central Bank dealing with. It has exclusive competence on trade policy. So when it's sanctions and the rest of it, it's got exclusive competence on competition policy. Again, a leverage of war when it comes to, say, big tech in the US or in China. And on top of that, it's got exclusive competence on customs. So you simply cannot talk about, France or Germany separately. And also, if I may lighten up a little bit, this is not about, but one of the problems I have with strategic autonomy, which in and of itself is an exciting discussion. And this comes back to one of the points that you made about, us becoming more and more protective of what we do. The problem is that for France, strategic autonomy also means Danone yogurt. And that's when we sort of, run into deeper trouble. So Mika, my very quick answer is to say that I don't think we know exactly where China is going to pivot in this particular game. But I think the expression that sort of, Russia has been a function of a policy either in the US or Europe is the correct one. All I want to say is that I think instead of giving it some kind of, how would I say, theoretical model, we need to look reality in the face. And for me, reality in the face at the moment is that Russia will be completely isolated, especially from the West. This means, full sanctions on politics, economics, finance, transport, sport, culture. And then from that premise, with a completely split Europe, on one side, authoritarian, dictatorial, aggressive Russia, on the other side, an alliance of democracies in or out of NATO or the EU. This is the split that we'll start looking at. And from that, we can start then analyzing, okay, what's China going to do? Is China going to pivot towards Russia, which is going to be less than 1% of the world economy pretty soon, or is it going to pivot towards Europe? And then start sort of creating the models. So this is my short answer.
Yeah, good scenarios, and that is what is actually happening, and we should be frank and honest on what we are seeing. It's colder than the Cold War. At least back then we had these intercultural ideas actually encoded in the Helsinki final agreement. Yeah. And that seems to be now cut as well. So the kind of the rules of engagement are colder, and therefore there's also unpredictabilities that come with that. but a good point. Anthea, perhaps you also reflect on Alex's point on the European Union.
Sure. So let me come in on this. Sorry, one thing it's actually up on the slides, but I didn't actually say it in the verbal. Those particular graphs are actually not my work. That I've taken them from somebody else, and I've got the reference to which piece it comes from. I don't remember the names of the authors. They're not doing it in a geoeconomic context. They're just doing it about like networks of connectivity. I've just brought out the work that they've done on that and sort of said it applies here. So I agree on many of these things. You do need to treat Europe as one, but I also think that what we're actually seeing is we're seeing a reconfiguration of power in a lot of federal structures that have assigned different divisions of power based on a certain assumption of the way the world works. And so, for example, in my country of Australia, we have a federation, and that federation has with our division of power, has put foreign relations to our nation's capital. So that's done at the federal level, but most economic stuff is done at the state level. And now that we're in this geoeconomic reality, we're having incredible tensions because, of course, the foreign relations and the economic are deeply integrated. And so how do you deal with that when you've split them? I think in Europe, you actually kind of got almost the reverse situation where trade and investment got centralized to Brussels, but a lot of the foreign affairs, defense stuff and cyber got left at home. And I do a lot of work with the European Commission on some of the different trade and investment things. I think that the big disconnect between them and the defense establishments in the different states and also with cyber is really hamstringing the sort of understanding of this sort of greater approach, but also how you coordinate it. So I see a federalism problem coming up with geoeconomics that I see in my own country, I see in your region, but actually in the flip and in the reverse. But I would ideally like to see some people do these kind of network connectivity diagrams for geoeconomics, but you'd want to do them across a variety of areas. So you want to be doing one in finance, one in trade. You'd also be wanting to do one about sort of energy connectivity. And this is something that I think I could see multiple people doing to sort of show what the different configurations are, but also tracking it over time to see which ones are splitting and which ones aren't. We're seeing that in global value chains, that we're starting to see them coming out in much more into 3 regional blocks, and one of them obviously being a European regional blocks. But it's different speeds and different things, and I think trying to have a better sense of that would be helpful. In terms of where I see the US, where I see China, so interestingly, we've been presenting the 6 Faces of Globalization book in China. So I've had a lot of sort of background of sort of thinking in that context about how our 6 different narratives about the pushback against economic globalization play out in a Chinese context. And interestingly, I think you can see representatives of all 6 of them within Chinese debates. There's obviously no one Chinese view, and we see a whole variety. Though I think the 2 that really come to the fore that are really in tension here with what's happening with Russia. First of all, you've got that very strong Davos, Xi goes to Davos, sort of embrace of the win-win establishment position. And that really is because China has benefited so much from its economic integration and still really wants to preserve as much of that order as it can have. And what's happening at the moment, obviously, with Russia and reactions to it is deeply, deeply destabilizing and something they absolutely don't want to support. But there's this other narrative, which I think of as the against Western hegemony narrative. And this is the one where China and Russia are not necessarily in agreement about what they're for, but they're in agreement about what they're against. And what they're against is Western hegemony and Western hypocrisy. And so we see in many different areas, cyber and space and a variety of ones where we see this kind of configuration where there has been an alliance and one that has been increasing in recent years, which is sort of very much about what they're against, this sort of hegemonic approach. And if you see, there's a really good article in The Atlantic at the moment saying if you look at the netizens in China that are very pro-Putin and pro-Russia, actually a lot of it isn't that they're pro-Russia, it's that they're anti-US and they just like someone who's sticking their finger up to the US. But what you see at the moment, I think, in China's posture is it's really desperately trying to deal with these 2 different things that it would not have made, I think, the move that Russia has made. And so it's not fully bunkering down on the against Western hegemony narrative, but it has also got to feel incredibly unhappy at some of the Western responses with the economic sanctions and the central bank, and particularly everything to do with the foreign currency reserves has got to absolutely send chills through China. And so it also doesn't want to fully retract. And so I suspect it's going to sort of uncomfortably sit on the fence for a while longer and not really make it clear which way it's going on these things. And there, I think, to go back to Mikhail's point, and I have a similar thing in one of my papers where I talk about that, the sort of, is it a duck, is it a rabbit? It's both, but we have trouble seeing it, is in this next period, I think it's very clear for many people, even if they didn't think it before, that Russia is now a duck or a rabbit, depending on how you do it, but they've shifted over. They've had a gestalt shift about how they think about Russia. But in this next period, I think people are going to still be much more, it's going to be much more ambiguous how to understand China. And so we're going to see much more of that sort of gestalt thing of some people saying it's a duck and some people saying it's a rabbit and some people saying it's a dragon, some people saying it's a panda. You're going to be in that era for a lot longer, whereas you're not going to be with Russia. And so I think there's going to be an interesting question about like what precedent does Europe take from this? Is it we can't trust Russia, which is a narrow precedent? Is it we can't trust Russia and China, which some people will take and I think others won't, which is a broader precedent? And interestingly, at the moment, everyone's like buddy, transatlantic, we can trust the US. But imagine Trump gets in a couple of years, is it also going to be we can't trust the US? And these are three very different ways in which you can define what the precedent is and what your reaction to it is. So that's kind of my thinking on it at the moment.
Mikael, if you go ahead and answer this first.
Thank you. There were two questions here in the chat box, and
yeah, that's one for you as well. Yes.
Yeah. So the first one, my namesake is asking, with regard to China's current choice of possibly sheltering Russia in face of Western economic containment, how do you see that playing out? Well, again, I go back to those security spheres that I had, and I think if you look at those. And well, maybe coupling also with what Alex said, that China has basically three options: Russia as a vassal state, the pivot to the West, or neutral / avoiding taking a clear stance. I would maybe phrase them slightly differently, but basically, yes, those are the options. And looking at those from these security spheres, well, obviously, outwardly, it doesn't really help China to take a clear stance either way. So outwardly, I would expect that China will still be sort of sitting on the fence, as you also said, Antti, and avoiding taking a clear stance. But if you look at those security spheres, I mean, you might want to ask which option is most threatening to the party and its position, including also, of course, the top leader himself. Which one is most threatening to regime stability? And if you think of it in that sense, I think I have to conclude that the number one option would be the most likely. So keeping Russia, China needs to have Russia there for a number of different reasons, and it won't necessarily openly be so open about it. But I would be very surprised if China were to pivot clearly to the West, because that doesn't seem to be in the interest of the system. And related to that, Apo had a comment or a question about sort of practically. Now we've seen this unity and willingness on the part of the West to have sort of a very broad range of very tough sanctions imposed on Russia. What if that were to happen in China's case? Would we see that? I think it would be much more difficult. I mean, to have this kind of unified front on that, infinitely more difficult to maintain that, because China is just so much important for a number of different countries. So that's my short answer. There's a much longer answer as well.
Okay, I think it's a good answer. The task is much more immense when it comes to China. It is a huge part of the global gross-national product and trade, kind of a decoupling, kind of a forceful decoupling that has quite a lot of risks. But I'm sure that China is watching. The other panelists can answer these questions as well, but we have Mikael's hand, and the time is also running out. So Mikael, go ahead.
Just a short comment on the two charts that Anthea showed us on the sort of connectivity, the financial side and the trade side. Indeed, I've I've looked at very similar kind of data. Last summer, I gathered some data on those connectivities, but doing so that I treated EU as a whole. And when you look, and so I have very similar charts, but on my charts, EU comes out as a great circle actually, on both sides, both in trade and in finance, which gives us an idea of the potential geoeconomic power that the EU actually has, but hasn't been using so much until now against Russia, right? So that sort of network centrality, or what I would call geoeconomic nodality, that's a measure of geoeconomic power, right? So we actually have the EU strong on both sides, finance and trade. We have US strong on both sides. EU is actually bigger on trade than the US, slightly bigger on the finance side and the trade side than the EU. And then we have China, very big on trade, very small on finance. So that gives us a picture of how the geoeconomic power politics could actually play out.
Yeah, that's a good point, and let me ask from Alex that question. Yes, EU has quite a lot of geoeconomic power, and now it is using it, but wasn't that basically because of Washington? So is this kind of a synchronous geoeconomic practice now example of how it is going to be used also in the future? So. European geoeconomic power under the umbrella of the US cooperation, kind of the transatlantic link in that?
Well, I guess yes and no. Two observations on this. The first one is that, I was sensing for many years this sort of reversal of European China policy, right? And we certainly know it in Finland. If you go to the 1990s, 2000s, even early 2010, it was very much about do business, trade, open up, do an investment agreement. In the beginning, of course, it was about manufacturing and producing cheap goods, but later on it turned around. And the fear that I have is that we're actually doing a complete reversal right now. So there was this sentiment of just saying that, whoa, we're not going to do any business with China whatsoever. I wrote an FT piece in 2016, rather provocatively. I called it, for China, Europe is the new Africa. And the argument was that the Chinese were mining, European data, IP companies, the way in which they were mining African raw materials. And at the time I said, we need to be careful not to go overboard, but we need to understand what's happening. We should have a European CFIUS type of a thing. My second answer to this is to say that I think actually, this, as I said earlier, this war gets a sort of a nudge Europe into a more powerful position, both in finance and in economics, in sort of playing a little bit the European card with China and with the US. So I don't think it's anymore so much directed from the US side. I'd say it was with Iran. We were very scared to do anything with Iran. Because of US pressure. But with China, I think we'll be able to play a little bit of a freer game. Final point on this, and sorry, I'm going to have to leave in 2 minutes sharp. I do think we need to start thinking a little bit ahead also about the social ramifications of this war in Europe. And right now we all feel unity, solidarity. It doesn't matter much that inflation is running high, food prices are going up, energy prices are going up, gas is going up. But there's going to be a moment when this reverses. And it's also going to be a moment where we'll see whether Europe tilts towards right-wing populism or what's going to happen. So just keep that in mind as well. And I do apologize, I'm going to have to jump off in 1 minute.
Yeah, well, thanks, Alex, on your participation. We have to end as well. So I will give 1 minute to both Anthea and Mikael. So Anthea, perhaps you can reflect on all of this and also the question of fragmentation.
So I completely agree with Mikael that Europe, when you treat it collectively, does very well in finance and also in trade. But I think we also need to look at other ones. I think it does less well in technology, it does less well in energy, and that's why I think we need to sort of see these in the round, because it's strong in some areas and weak in others, and it's really the collective of those things that I think are important. Then to go to Alex's point, so I think this is exactly what we're seeing, that the scope kind of goes in one direction, it's a duck, and then it changes and it's a rabbit. But the reality is it's a duck and a rabbit. And we actually know from human psychology, well, from visual optical stuff, we tend to see one and the other. We really struggle to see both at the same time. And in terms of psychology, it's very clear that people struggle with trade-offs. And so when you hear somebody saying, oh, it's good for economics and good for security and good for this and good for that, it's quite often a sign that they actually struggle with trade-offs. And so they want to get everything to align. So it feels like it's good on every account. The reality in some of these things is they're pointing in different directions, and we need to be able to work out how we value and weigh those things. And psychologically, we are poorly equipped to do that. And so I think that's part of what Alex is talking about, this sort of movement from one to the other. We need to be able to integrate both and find ways to go through, and we're not well set up to do it.
Thank you, Mikael.
My point follows very similar sort of trains of thought here. So I've also been struck by this quickness of the change, and you have to remember that just up until 2015 or so, China wasn't investing very much in the EU at all, and it kept getting this message from everyone: please come and invest, come and do this, and then they do, and within 2 years, everybody says basically this is a problem, we shouldn't have these investments and so on. So I mean, just looking at it from China's perspective, you might be a bit confused about the messages here. First, everybody welcomes you, and then when you come, finally do something, then you should get out. So yes, so striking this balance is really, I think, the one of the key issues here, to try to see both the rabbit and the duck at the same time, or whatever you want to use in case of China. And right now it seems very difficult. I mean, if you take what would have been considered a critical view now, this might be considered, leaning too much in the direction of China even. So it's completely shifted sort of the debate if you look at the last 10 years. And striking the right balance is where we need to try to do in this case.
Balance, finding those and kind of positive outcomes in the mess. It is, of course, a very contingent process, and this is now clear. But it has been an excellent start for the conference today, and I wish good luck with the rest of the panels. And I thank the audience on participation, and also, of course, the great panelists that we had today. So thank you very much, and we will see again on this topic. It doesn't go away. So thank you very much.
Thank you.